University of Mainz, Germany, and finally he became Nurse Independent Research Fellow at University of Oxford. Ladies and gentlemen, there will be a short question and answer at the end of the presentation. To ask a question, audience may use Q&A feature in Zoom or write your question in YouTube comment section during the presentation. The question should be in this following format. Please attention: name underscore institution or affiliation, and then underscore question. Due to the limitation, we will start 3 questions and continue to the remaining if the time is adequate. Before we start the presentation from the invited speaker, I would like to welcome Dr. Irwan Melano, the Dean of Faculty of Earth Science and Technology, ITB, to give the opening speech. Dr. Irwan Melano, please welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Mirzam. Again, thank you, Mike, for joining with us. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's guest lectures. Today's guest lecture is very special because we have Mike Cassidy from University of Oxford. And the title of his presentations today is he tried to answer one of the difficult or important questions in volcano monitoring: explosive or effusive? What controls the eruptive style of volcanoes? I think Mike already published the papers with this title maybe 2 years ago, I think, in Nature. The reason why this topic is very important because the main missions of volcano monitoring is very simple: to save people's lives. And Indonesia, currently we have around 70 volcano observation posts that observe around 69 active volcanoes. Actually, we have more than 120 active volcanoes, but at this time being, we can only observe closely for about 69 active volcanoes. Actually, the volcano monitoring in Indonesia that conducted by Center for Volcanology and Geological Hazard Mitigations this year it's been already 100 years older than our country itself. But actually, volcano monitoring and mitigations by voluntary, by researcher, by individuals was carried out long before 100 years ago. For example, the records of the eruptions of Tambora 1815 or Krakatau 1883. But the establishment and presence of the official observation service itself is in 1920. And this year we have 100 years celebrations of the official national volcano observation in Indonesia. And explosive volcanic eruptions can have devastating societal impacts on populations, and it may cause a huge loss of human life, and also not only human lives, but also it gives very serious impact to our economy. And one of the biggest challenges in volcanic hazard assessment is to understand how and why eruption style change within the same eruptive period, or even from one eruption to the next at one given volcano. I read from your papers that magma ascent and decompression rate mostly coupled between magma ascent and decompression rate are perhaps the most critical parameters controlling volcanic style. And I believe today you will talk these important topics. So I would like to thanks to Mike we have been working with ITB, already mentioned by Dr. Mirjam, since 2017. And we really hope this collaboration will continue. And to all the participants, I believe that by joining in this webinar, we are in the right place and in the right time to understand how we can reduce the risk of volcanic eruption in Indonesia. And I wish you all a very good and successful webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Irwan. Thank you very much, Dr. Irwan Melano, for the warm greeting for the audience and also for our colleague, Dr. Mike from the University of Oxford. Okay, without further ado, please welcome Dr. Michael Cassidy from the University of Oxford. The time is yours.
Thank you very much, Mirzam and Erwan. It's a really nice introduction. And you're so right. So I think explosive and effusive eruptions have a bearing on lots of the volcanic hazards that you see in Indonesia. So I think it's a hugely kind of important problem. So I've been working with Mirzam and Idam, as well as Taufig and Edo in the past and currently. And we've been looking at volcanoes, for instance, like Krakatoa especially, and I've got a PhD student looking at that, and also other PhD students looking into other volcanoes such as Mount Rinjani as well in Lombok. And Indonesia has a lot of these really explosive and also effusive volcanic eruptions that have a huge impact to the populations. They really require good monitoring in order to understand these. And I guess with some of my studies that have been going on in other volcanoes, like the ones I mentioned, but also ones outside Indonesia, what seems to be a very much an observation from all of these eruptions or these volcanoes is that we have both effusive and explosive eruptions. And I'll go into more about those in a second. This picture on the right here, this is Kelut volcano in Java, East Java, which I've visited a few times and I'll talk about later. And I think after the 1919 eruption, that's kind of what started part of the monitoring network in Indonesia. So I think that's quite interesting that Irwan talked about that anniversary of the 1920s, the startup of volcano monitoring in Indonesia. And I think it was partly a relation due to the 5,000 or more people that died from the Kelut eruption. So I'll talk a bit about Kelut later in the talk, but essentially, and Irwan talked about this briefly as well, that if you don't manage to tune into the whole talk or lose focus, essentially the main message, what controls volcano explosivity is how much the gas can be released from the magma. So if it loses lots of gas from the magma, then it's more likely to be an effusive eruption. If the gas becomes retained within the magma, then it's more likely to be explosive. And that's very much controlled by how fast the magma moves. So its ascent rate and its decompression rate. So I'll go on and talk about this now. So what do we mean by effusive eruptions, or I guess you could call them flow eruptions? And here's an example. I'm going to show you a brief video of Hawaii, where we can see volcanic eruptions that occur commonly, and they occur with these lava flows. And you can see that these slow-moving lava flows, sometimes effusive eruptions can be effusive dome eruptions, but you can see the type of damage that this causes. So that was an American video, and it kind of tries to exaggerate the impact of the eruption of Kilauea in Hawaii a number of years ago. But it's important to note that generally effusive eruptions have a limited amount of damage or fatalities, people dying as a result of their eruptions. That's not always the case, but compared to explosive eruptions, they have a much more local impact. Whereas explosive eruptions, and here's a video from Chile a few years ago from Calbuco, of an eruptive cloud. And explosive eruptions are not these lava flows or slow-moving coherent magma domes, but instead the magma itself, it could be exactly the same magma as you saw in Hawaii, but in this instance, it's fragmented into millions of different pieces. So this is an ash cloud, and ash is essentially magma which has been broken up into millions of different pieces and been sent into the atmosphere at a high altitude. And these can have much more far-flung effects that can affect the whole country, the whole regions, continents, or even the whole world if there's enough volume of magma. And Indonesia, you see that with Toba in the past. Tambora was mentioned as well, Krakatoa. So essentially this ash is lots of tiny fragments of glass, of broken up cooled magma, but that can have huge impacts in terms of producing lots of hazards such as pyroclastic flows or even ash fallout into lots of different areas that could be thousands of kilometers apart from the volcano itself. So we have a slight problem in volcanology in that we're getting better at understanding or trying to forecast eruptions. So we can use seismicity, which is the dominant way we can monitor volcanic eruptions. We're starting to use the deformation. So this is an example from a satellite image, looking at the inflation or the deflation of a magma that you can see from space. And you can also do these same measurements by putting instruments like tilt meters and GPS on the flanks of the volcano. And then we can also look at the gas and how the gas comes out of the volcano. In this instance is from Mexico, where we measured SO2 gas, which you can see there coming out around here. So we can use some of these techniques to understand how or when, I guess, the volcano might erupt and if the volcano might erupt. The problem at the moment we face is that we're still not very good at figuring out what style of an eruption will occur. Will it be effusive or will it be explosive? Also, how big will this eruption be? And of course, that's critical because we know that explosive eruptions, as I just mentioned, can have a devastating impact in a wide area, whereas effusive eruptions generally have a more localized impact. The other problem is that we found in a paper that I published last year that generally explosive eruptions seem to come with less warning, and effusive eruptions seem to come with a lot more warning. That's because the magma generally ascends much slower in an effusive eruption and therefore comes with more warning. So this is an example where I've got some ascent rates that we've been able to estimate, and also from what ascent rates of the magma, and also from what depth the magma was stored at. So if you know the rate and the depth, then you can work out how long the magma took to ascend. And here on this axis, you can see that this is years, months, weeks, days, hours, or minutes that the magma takes to ascend. And on this axis, you can see lots of different volcano examples throughout history, including some Indonesian examples like Kelut as well. So what we find is that the effusive eruptions, which I'm going to plot in a second, which are going to be in red, and the explosive eruptions are in black. And I've also going to, with these green spots, I'm going to plot on this graph when the volcanologists saw the first signs that the volcano might be waking up. So here you can see for most eruptions, so this one's in Chile a few years ago, you can see that there was a lot more warning for these effusive eruptions than the explosive eruptions. What you find is that these red bars generally show that the magma ascended in months to weeks and sometimes years it took to ascend. So it's a long time for this magma to ascend. Whereas for these black bars, which are the explosive eruption, magma takes sometimes days, but often more likely hours or minutes to ascend. And so that means that there's generally less warning. It means that when you see a signal of seismicity, deformation, it doesn't always mean that magma is moving to the surface. And we know this because there's a big disconnect between when you start to see explosive eruptions, or sorry, the onset of unrest, the first signals that the volcano might be waking up. The volcano isn't actually, the magma isn't actually ascending underneath the volcano, like this example in Pinatubo, like this example in Colima, and also in Kelut. We see from this compilation that explosive eruptions ascend faster, and the average from this compilation is 10 hours. So it's really not a lot of time. And generally they have shorter unrest periods. So the volcano wakes up on average 200 days, 220 days before it starts to erupt. Effusive eruptions, on the other hand, have longer ascent durations. So sometimes the average could be 98 days. They generally have more warning. So 380 days, so perhaps a year is the average amount of warning before the eruptions. We also did another compilation where we looked at all the VEI, which is Volcano Explosivity Index, over 4. This goes up to 8, but generally over 4 are quite explosive eruptions. So since 1992, there's been about 22 eruptions that have been significantly explosive enough to be called VEI 4. And what we find is that over half of these show less than 30 days of unrest. So even when we've had all these monitoring equipment since the 90s, these explosive eruptions can only give you sometimes a month of unrest. And this is the problem, really, is that explosive eruptions often come with little warning. So to get ahead of this problem, before we start to see the signals of an impending eruption, what we need to do is we need to understand the factors that control eruptive style. So what controls whether it's explosive or effusive. And in 2018, I had a paper that looked at these, and a lot of my presentation is going to be based on this paper in 2018. And we made up a table which talks about all the different parameters which could be affecting eruptive style. You can see on the left here. So this is a kind of reference table, and it might tell you what controls that particular parameter and how does that affect eruptive style. And it has the references that with it that you can go to and understand yourself as well. I guess the summary from this table is that there's lots of different factors, and it's not a simple problem. There's lots of complicated problems, and much of those factors are interrelated. So for instance, we could have factors which are internal to the magma, things like temperature, intrinsic otherwise, or things that are extrinsic, things like the vent and conduit geometry, which are external to the magma itself. But some of these can be linked. So for instance, temperature, magma temperature can have an effect regarding how the crystals grow and how the bubbles grow as well, and the viscosity of the magma. But we'll talk about that in slightly later in the talk. And what you should also know is that magma style controls or eruptive style controls don't just occur near the surface or in any one place, but they can be controlled by lots of different parts of the volcanic system. From the deeper system in the magma reservoir, where we can have processes such as magma coming into the reservoir, magma mixing, that can drive explosive eruptions or sometimes drive effusive eruptions too. We have processes that occur within the conduit, so within the top maybe 3 kilometers, 2 kilometers, where we have processes such as microlite growth, the growth of these very small crystals, and growth of bubbles. and it's those bubbles which are important, which carry the gas, which is important in controlling the eruptive force. But we can also have processes that occur at the very surface, things like a dome collapse or a flank collapse, or even a caldera collapse like we saw on Krakatoa. And this can have downward propagating effects on the eruptive style. So an initiation here, or say a caldera collapse, can then impact the eruptive style of the magma several kilometers underneath the volcano. I guess the main, one of the main processes or factors that control eruptive style is the viscosity of the magma. And this video shows in a nice way something like a honey, showing that viscosity can be very thick, can be very high, like in a very cold honey, if you like, and its ability for the substance to resist flow. This is important because it very much controls how much the volcano, or how much the magma rather, can keep hold of its gas. So if it can keep hold of its gas well, then generally you're more likely to have an explosive eruption. And this is why, and the viscosity is very much related to the composition of the magma. And this is why you find that more silicic eruptions that have more silica, such as rhyolite magmas or andesite magmas, those are more likely to produce explosive eruptions compared to eruptions that erupt basalt and things like that, which have less silica, they are low viscosity, and generally they have less explosive eruptions. But there's more to this, and actually there's lots of different exceptions and complexity, which I'll talk to you about. The viscosity is very much controlled by the chemical composition, and this is because the higher amounts of silica that you have make sure that you can form these very strong bands of silica tetrahedra, which actually resist flow. Whereas in a basalt, for instance, over here, you have less silica, less of those silica tetrahedra, and more of these network modifying ions. Essentially, it means that you can flow the magma much more easily. So it's something like sticky honey versus water. But viscosity is also impacted by temperature and also by the presence of crystals, which can get in the way. The another reason why viscosity is important is that high viscosity magma is more likely to fragment into ash more easily. And if we remember back to the video I just showed at the start, it's that fragmentation, so the breaking up of magma into millions of different pieces, that causes the ash. And when you have a high viscosity magma, this, because of its material properties, is much more likely to happen. So let me explain that. And this is something called the glass transition. So if we have down here, we have low viscosity on the left and high viscosity on the right. And if we have a liquid, which is this red region, this is our magma, generally you need less or slow strain rates. In other words, slow amounts of magma decompression rate to actually shear the magma and send it into the glass regime here. And this will mean that you're producing lots of tiny fragments of ash and glass. Whereas if you have a basalt over here, which is lower viscosity generally, although sometimes basalts can have crystals, making it high viscosity. But if you have a crystal poor basalt, then you require much faster strain rates. So you require the magma to pull itself apart much more vigorously, much faster, in order to produce ash. And it's that ash that defines what an explosive eruption is. So for those two reasons, magma viscosity is very important. And that's why we see that general pattern of explosive eruptions being more silica rich and effusive eruptions being more silica poor. But this isn't always the case. As always, because we're talking about nature and volcanoes, it's always complexity, and there's always complications in the natural system. So what we see is that actually we see the same magma compositions such as basalt or andesite or rhyolite, we can have the same composition, the same amount of dissolved gases to start with, but we can see different eruptive styles. So why is that? So the main reason we find is that this is related to the ascent rate. So how fast the magma can ascend from its magma storage region up towards the surface. That has the biggest effect, more so than viscosity, which is really interesting. So the magma ascent rate, or another way of looking at it, is the magma decompression rate. In other words, how fast a magma can lose pressure very quickly. And we'll talk about that later. But for the most part, they remain coupled. They're the same thing. So what we're going to show here, there's on the x-axis here, we have lots of different examples of different volcanoes. And here we have the ascent rate on this axis here. And what we find is that the explosive eruptions, which are in black, and the symbols relate to how these ascent rates were measured. But what we find is that the ascent rates generally for explosive eruptions is much higher than for the effusive eruptions, which are found in red. But you can see that the line that defines this boundary is not simple. It's not even. It's undulating, and it's not a clear transition. And that's because when you see these types of ascent rates where we have 0.01, perhaps up to 0.1 meters per second, we find that there's sometimes a transition quickly between effusive and explosive eruptions. And you see that in volcanoes, for example, in Seremu, Merapi is a good example of that. Sometimes you have dome eruptions, and then very quickly, almost minutes afterwards, we have transitions to explosive eruptions. And because it sits on the exact kind of ascent rates or decompression rates around this region over here. So what drives magma ascent? Well, the main thing that drives magma ascent is degassing. So how the volatiles, those dissolved gases in the magma, are released. So it starts off really, if you imagine a Coca-Cola bottle, it starts off with the volatiles. An unopened Coca-Cola bottle starts with the volatiles which are dissolved within the magma. Then you can start to exsolve the volatiles. In other ways, another way of saying that is that the volatiles come out of solution and they start to form bubbles. And it's these bubbles that give it the buoyancy that enabled it to carry it up, like that famous film. And it's that buoyancy that gives that can promote faster ascent rates. So more exsolved gases that remain coupled to the magma, faster ascent rates. Sometimes though, you can get to the point where there's enough bubbles that they start to join up and they start to coalesce, and those bubbles can start to form different pathways where gas can be then released from the system entirely. And we can call that open system degassing. In this instance, the gas is able to freely move from the magma or decouple from the magma. In this instance, where we just have the bubbles within the magma but not connecting, we can call this a closed system degassing because they remain coupled to the magma. And this is very much important when we're talking about explosive eruptions, because in a closed system degassing regime, we start off with volatiles coupled to the melt. And this starts us off with a feedback, which I'll describe in a second, which promotes faster ascent and therefore more explosive eruptions. So if the volatiles remain coupled to the melt, so the bubbles are just there, then we have more decompression as the magma moves up. And this means that more volatiles go into those bubbles, makes them more buoyant. The further decompression as the magma comes up to the surface means that these bubbles then grow and expand. And that promotes or increases the buoyancy, and it also increases the overpressure. So that's how much pressure is the magma is under as it ascends. This leads to faster ascent rate and decompression rate. We can also have, if we have a faster decompression rate, this has an interesting effect that it produces smaller bubbles instead of big bubbles. And that has an impact because smaller bubbles limit the permeability. They're less likely to join up with each other, and they limit how much the bubbles can join up and form those permeable pathworks, and the gas can escape from the system. So you increase the decompression rate or the ascent rate, in other words, then you mean that less gas is lost from the magma. We can sometimes produce these kind of shear thinning viscosities that can increase the ascent rate. And all of these processes allow less time for outgassing to occur. And this is key. So faster ascent rates mean that less gas can be released. And that means that more volatiles remain coupled to the melt. So it keeps on going round and round and round until we end up with a fast ascending gas-rich magma that leads to an explosive eruption. Now, sometimes what happens is that we have this transition between explosive and then effusive. So eventually the gas that drives the eruption can be lost through these permeable pathways like so, where the pressure might dissipate, it might lose the pressure. And this starts us off with the opposite feedback system. So in this instance, volatiles decouple from the melt. You have less exsolution and bubble growth. You start to form crystals as you ascend the magma. And these little crystals called microlites can then increase the viscosity to the point where it slows the magma down. And when it slows the magma down, that means that there's more time for outgassing, and there's also less buoyancy, less energy for that magma to ascend faster. And this means that more volatiles become decoupled or get lost from the melt. And all of these feedbacks can go round in a circle and lead to something called open system degassing, and that decreases the explosive potential. So generally, for effusive eruptions like we see for dome eruptions or lava flow eruptions, they undergo these processes with open system processes. I talked briefly about eruptive style transitions, and Erwan talked about this briefly at the start as well, that you can talk about eruptive style transitions in two different scales. So one different scale is something you might see in Merapi or Seremu, is that you have very fast transitions in one particular eruptive phase. So you can have dome growth and volcano eruptions maybe separated by minutes or hours. And so there's lots of competing processes that occur here. And in fact, if we look at a lot of the eruptions, I've looked through 100 or so eruptions since 2000, and I found that more often than not, 61% of the time, these eruptions comprised both effusive and explosive activity. But this really tells us that if you are starting to see a significant eruption beginning that might go on for years or months, or that you're more likely to see both styles of eruptions that occur. But we also see, so I'll talk about the first one in a second, and I'll talk about this one later on the talk. And this one is talking about the transition that occurs on the same volcano, but over several different eruptions. So we could have a lava flow, and then several years later, could be a long repose interval, we might have a Plinian eruption. But it could be the same composition of magma, but you see this transition nonetheless. And Kelut is a really good example of that, which I'll talk about later. We'll first briefly talk through where we have the transitions within a single phase. And I looked through, in my 2018 paper, I looked through a database called the Dome House database created by the USGS in Ogburn et al. 2015. And this graph basically shows where the most explosive eruption occurs during a couple dome and explosive eruption phase. So for instance, we find that most of the eruptions, most of the most explosive eruptions within these dome eruptions occurred in the first quarter of the eruptive period. 70% of the most explosive eruptions happen at the start. Whereas there's a third of eruptions that seem to occur right near the end of an eruptive period. So that means that it could be during or after dome activity. So this tells us for that first type of eruptive transition where it's within an eruptive phase, and thinking about Merapi here, for instance, the general pattern we see is that it goes from explosive to effusive eruptions. And sometimes some people thought the cause for this could be that the volatile content of the magma might be decreasing over time. But we can show by looking at melt inclusions that this isn't the case. So actually, we think it's more case that it's shifting from closed system to open system degassing. And that's kind of what I've been talking about in the start of my talk about these feedbacks that can very much control the ascent rate, decompression rate, and also how much gas is lost from the system. However, there's always exceptions. And what we find in explosive or say effusive eruptions is that we can have effusive eruptions that then transition to more explosive eruptions. And this is the part of the graph that I was talking about in the last slide, where we find a third of the most explosive eruptions occur after a dome eruption, which is really interesting. So what could be happening here? And this could be another set of feedbacks that result from this open system degassing feedback. So when the volatiles decouple from the melt, if they're lost from the system entirely, then this normally leads to open system degassing feedback. We can lead to an effusive eruption. But sometimes these exhaled volatiles, these gases, can start to accumulate and get trapped underneath a plug or a dome, for instance. These can increase in pressure, overpressure, until there's kind of a burp, or there's a kind of the pressure that it is the pressure that confines the gas is then overcome, and that can lead to an explosive eruption, and that's very common in volcanic eruptions or even strombolian eruptions that we see in Anak Krakatoa, for instance, where we have these kind of bursts of gas-rich kind of explosive eruptions that are very short-lived normally. What we can also find in long-lived dome-forming eruptions like the Soufriere Hills in Montserrat in the Caribbean, potentially also Merapi and these other dome-forming eruptions, is that we start to form small crystals in the magma because the crystals have time to form under these slow ascent rates. And we have these degassing-induced ascent rates, and these can increase the magma viscosity and therefore make it slower to ascend. But this normally means that more gas can be released. But if the viscosity increases so much, this can actually stop the gases from being released at all. It can limit that outgassing, and actually that can make it more explosive as well. And this is very common for Soufriere Hills, as I said before, and can lead to volcanic explosive eruptions where the magma is so sticky in the shallow conduit that it can no longer flow. But this combination of positive and negative feedbacks that we've seen between open system degassing feedback is one way that we can generate that episodicity or even periodicity that we see at volcanoes that affect the eruptive rate and also the eruptive style. So really what this tells us is that there's no simple way of producing explosive volcanism. In fact, there's lots of different ways that can produce explosive eruptions. And this diagram from this paper shows that quite well. So we can have explosive eruptions triggered by a magma injection, or they don't have to be triggered by a magma injection. We can have explosive eruptions that are formed from fast ascent, which is what I've been talking about with closed system degassing. Or we can have volcanic eruptions that can be slow. And those are some examples that I was talking about before, with exhaled gas accumulation and also stalling, increasing the viscosity with those small microlite crystals at shallow levels. And we can also have the impact of external forces, which adds another layer of complexity. So this could be things like water and magma interacting, that we see. Kelut is an example of this sometimes, where it has a lake inside the volcano, which can affect the explosivity of the magma. And also we can have unloading of the magma at Mount St. Helens, where we had a flank collapse at the surface, which can then drive changes in explosive volcanic eruptions. And another example of that is Anak Krakatoa in 2018, which saw much more explosive eruptions after it collapsed into the sea, causing that tsunami. So although there's lots of different factors, and hopefully I haven't confused you completely by talking about all these different factors, but this diagram is really to combine all those factors into two main points, really, or two main processes. So this kind of suggests that the main processes are the main factors that control explosive or effusive eruptions can be plotted on this diagram, which are controlled by the ascent rate, which is dependent on lots of different factors, and also how easily the magma can outgas, which is dependent on viscosity as well as other factors as well. At faster ascent rates, we are more likely to be in this regime of an explosive regime, and at lower amounts of outgassing. So this is where we have explosive eruptions, but higher amounts of outgassing and lower ascent rates, you're more likely to be in an effusive regime, more likely to form an effusive eruptions. So what we can do is we can plot on certain magma ascent paths. So for instance, here's one example. I'm just going to call this A. And this is the example, and this is, we take it from where the magma is stored in the magma chamber. And at this particular time, there's no ascent. So the magma is stored in a magma reservoir. But as as it starts to ascend, the volatiles in this instance remain coupled to the magma. So it's closed system degassing. And that means that the outgassing efficiency goes lower, and that in turn increases the ascent rate and leads to this closed system degassing. And this is that closed system degassing feedback mechanism that I talked about at the start that can drive it into these plinning eruptions. And then sometimes after the gas is lost, then these plinning eruptions can turn into more effusive or dome forming eruptions that we commonly see. We can also have the same type of magma, so it has the same outgassing efficiency. Say this is andesite, for instance. This can also ascend, but this time it's ascending in an open system degassing regime. So this means that the outgassing efficiency goes up, the ascent rate slows, and this generally sends it into an effusive regime. But we do have those feedbacks which mean that it can send it into a more explosive regime. This was one of them, was that the crystallization can increase the viscosity, lessening how much or limiting the outgassing. So this goes down on this y-axis, and it can send it into this explosive regime. The gases are then released, becomes open system degassing, but then again, you can start to form these crystals. So that can go through in this whole cycle, like you see in, for example, in Merapi or Seramu, these kind of dome forming eruptions that keep going through these cycles. But also you can see perhaps for less viscous eruptions. So for instance, if you have a basaltic andesite up here, you can see that it's plots high on this y-axis because of its viscosity. It's more likely to outgas. It's thinner, the gas can be released more easily. And generally what you find is that the ascent rate increases as you go up, as you ascend in the magma. But at some point, if the gases can't be released at the top, then they can start to form these exolved gas accumulations. And if those become voluminous enough, if they increase the pressure enough, then this can limit your outgassing efficiency. So you go down on this y-axis, and then you can form these kind of short bursts of strombolian or even volcanic eruptions, explosive eruptions. And again, you commonly see this at things like Anak Krakatoa, where you have these kind of bursts of magma. But then this can also have these cycles as well. And another example here, down here, an example where we don't see fast ascent rate, but actually the ascent rate and the decompression rate becomes decoupled. So you can have a magma which actually ascends very slowly to the surface, like in Mount St. Helens in 1980. But then we have a depressurization event. We had the flank collapse, which then decompressed the magma very quickly. And this produced a decompression wave that went down through the magma and produced this really explosive eruption, Plinian eruption. And the same thing we think has happened to the Anak Krakatoa after the landslide and tsunami. We found this really explosive, voluminous magma that was tapped by this decompression event that occurred at the surface. And this is a picture that we saw from Edo. Edo took this with his drone, from ITB, doing some fantastic work, and we got some images like this. And this shows Anak Krakatoa in 2018. This was a few summers ago. Or was it just last summer that we took this image? You can see this kind of scar from the landslide here, and actually a huge amount of the edifice slid into the sea, and then where all of this was absent as well, the volcano was 300 meters in height. It then lost a lot of that height and became only 100 meters high, and this initiated downward propagating wave, a decompression wave that produced more explosive eruptions and actually produced all of this tephra, this ash you can see here, and built up the edifice afterwards in a very quick succession of maybe 11 days after the volcano built up the edifice again and created this lake. And I believe this lake is no longer there, and I think a lava flow is coming out now. So it's shifted even in the last year or so from very explosive and phreatomagmatic, so the water magma interaction, to now being effusive, which is really interesting. So many good examples in Indonesia of volcanoes that are doing these things. So in terms of what eruptive style research is doing at the moment, I think we're very good at understanding volcanic eruptions. Some of the eruptions that we might see in Merapi, Serumu, volcanoes like that, Ruang. They're quite frequent. We can monitor and directly monitor and measure those frequently, as we've done in Colima in Mexico. I spent some time doing that. We can also replicate the decompression triggered eruptions. So in other instances, the top-down eruptions, the ones that are triggered by some sort of unloading. And we can do this in the lab. There's labs in Munich that can do these shock, and Japan that can do these shock tube experiments where you release the pressure very quickly and observe to see how the magma fragments and foams, kind of like increasing that strain rate as I talked about at the start. I find in my research that the least well studied at the moment are these bottom-up Plinian eruptions. So the ones that are driven by that closed system degassing regime and that produce these explosive eruptions. They seem to occur less frequently. They're hard to model with numerical models, and they're very hard to simulate in the lab. And also they're less affected by those shallow level processes, things like bubble growth in the conduit. And that's because the magma is moving so fast at that rate that those processes become inefficient. They don't really matter anymore. So a lot of the research I'm doing currently is really trying to understand the factors that control whether we start to go into an explosive regime, which would be an open system degassing regime. Sorry, that would be effusive, sorry. Whether you have an open system degassing, or whether we start with closed system degassing. I think that's a really interesting problem that could be tackled in the next few years. I have several hypotheses that could account for this. It could be that we're seeing outgassing prior to ascent. So we could have the viscosity changing, or the volatiles could be changing, separating. And this could affect the initial ascent rate. Or it could be the other way around. So outgassing in this instance would affect the ascent rate, but it could be that the initial ascent rate could drive the outgassing, which could be driven by the magma overpressure. Pressure is built up in the magma at depth, or it could be how fast magma can be decompressed. And this is really what I'm trying to understand with my research, and how to perhaps transform this knowledge that we know about what controls eruptive style into kind of understanding how to forecast those signals. So how do they start in the magma reservoir? So we do a range of different experiments. We can also look at the crystals themselves. So this is a crystal from Kelut, very similar to ones that you find in Krakatoa as well. We have these very, this is a plagioclase crystal, and we find lots of these kind of zones that might record kind of a history of what the magma has been doing through time as the magma chamber has grown. And I'll talk about an example about this in a second. And I'm also able to do in my lab experiments that can mimic, that can replicate the exact conditions that occur within a magma reservoir. So we can look at the same pressures, temperatures, volatile contents, oxidation conditions. So we can actually replicate what conditions occurred before an explosive eruption and what magma conditions occurred before an effusive eruption. If we know this, then we might be able to understand what unrest signals might help in telling us whether we're going to have an explosive or an effusive eruption. So all of this is leading to, hopefully, so that we can better forecast eruptions in the future. So an example from that is Kelut volcano in Indonesia. So this is some of the work I was doing before I met Mirzam as well. Been looking at Kelut in East Java, as you can see here. And it's a very active volcano. Some of you might know it, or maybe you live near it, your families live near it. It's a really active volcano, 7 eruptions in the past century. And also very unpredictable eruptions, because 5 of these have been explosive and 2 of these have been effusive. And the latest ones were in 2014, where we saw a very explosive eruption that occurred on Valentine's Day in 2014. In 2007, only a few years before that, we found that we had a very effusive eruption, solely effusive, this kind of dome forming eruption. And what's really interesting is that the composition is very, very similar between these 2 eruptions, and indeed between all the different effusive and explosive eruptions in Kelut. It's this crystal-rich basaltic andesite. And they also had, before their eruptions, different unrest signatures, so different monitoring signals. What we wanted to answer is, do the conditions of magma storage change between the effusive and explosive eruptions? So I'm going to try and answer that in the next few slides. So we can first understand the pre-eruptive magma state using experiments. And what we've done is use the experiments that I showed you in the lab. And we do multiple experiments at different pressures and temperatures and volatile contents. We try and match that to the chemical composition that we see in the natural glass or the melt inclusions in the magma. And that can tell us exactly how the magma was stored before the effusive and the explosive eruptions. So for the explosive eruptions, so for instance, in 2014, 1990, or some older eruptions that we found in the geological record, we find that the temperatures were of about 1,000 degrees. The pressures were about 50 to 100 megapascals, which equates to about 2 to 4 kilometers underneath the volcano, so quite shallow. And we found that these magmas were derived from water-saturated magmas. So in other words, there wasn't, this XH2O is a ratio between CO2, another very common magma gas, and water. What we find in the explosive eruptions is that there was mostly water, not much CO2. Whereas for the effusive eruption in 2007, where temperatures were similar, perhaps slightly hotter. Pressures were exactly the same, 50 to 100 megapascals. So that means it probably occupied the same magma space, the same magma reservoir. The biggest difference we found is that the water content was different. So the actual, or not really the water content, but the ratio between CO2 and water was different. In this case, it was water undersaturated. In the effusive eruption, we had more CO2. And what this does is it enhances the outgassing because CO2 exsolves at deeper depths. And it also lowers the water saturation. And this means that there's less potential for buoyancy, for fast exsolution-driven ascent. So less of an effect of that buoyancy. So that GIF that I showed you earlier with the up, which shows lots of water, dissolved water bubbles coming up with the magma, increasing the ascent. If there's more CO2 in that instance, then it doesn't produce that effect as well. So that's the experimental constraints that we had, but we can also look at the analytical petrology. So this is an example from crystals that we see in Kelut, which show multiple zones of different chemistries of those crystals, and also lots of these different bubbles which you can see here, which are tiny melt inclusions within the crystals. And a melt inclusion is essentially entrapped magma that's enclosed in the crystal and that doesn't equilibrate with the surrounding crystal. So it means that you can look at a snapshot of what that magma was doing before the eruption. So this looks like a complicated diagram. What we're seeing is basically the distance from the rim of the crystal. This is the core and this is the rim, for example, the crystal that we've just seen. So the rim and then the core. And this shows the blue line shows the changes in the chemistry of the crystal in a northite content, which is essentially the calcium and sodium ratio. And you can also see in red, these kind of white and red dots are measured water contents of those melt inclusions, those small bits of entrapped melt that I showed you before. When we match these up together, what we can see is that we get the two different regimes, two different cycles within the Kelut magma reservoir, which are very much dependent on the magma water and the temperature cycles. So right next to the rim, so in other words, just before the magma exploded in 2014, the magma was in a cold and water-rich regime. So this means that the magma had undergone cooling and differentiation, it had become more silica-rich. However, there were some instances within the crystals that we saw which were much hotter and they were much less water-rich, so water-poor. And we think this is associated with an influx of more magma, which heated the magma, but that magma was water poorer, so then it diluted the volatile contents. This is in a study that we did a few years ago. So if we know the temperature of the magma, we know the water content, and we know the composition through the measurements that we made in that last thing, what we can do is work out the magma viscosity. And what this does, so this is the core and the rim again, over towards this side this time. what we can see is because of these cycles, these cold and water rich and the hot and water poor cycles, you can see a variation in the viscosity, where the cold and water rich cycles are very much higher viscosity, whereas the hot and water poor cycles are at a lower viscosity. What we see just before the 2014 explosive eruption is that the magma was a higher viscosity. We saw that it was colder and also water saturated. And these are conditions we think that led to this closed system degassing, made it more explosive. So it went into those different feedbacks that we saw at the start. Whereas if you had magma input from below of warm magma, this reduced the viscosity. It made the water lower. It was more water undersaturated. We had more CO2 and this outgasses earlier. So we go into a regime where we had this open system degassing, where a lot of this CO2 is being released from the magma. And that sends us into a more effusive regime that we saw in 2007. Now, interestingly, so we're seeing here in Kelut, and this is doesn't really speak for all the volcanoes in the world, but certainly in Kelut, we find that viscosity and the volatiles seem to control the eruptive style and the difference between open and closed system. But if we relate that to the type of forecasting that we saw, or the monitoring signals that we saw before the eruption, we find something really interesting. So before the 2007 effusive eruption, we saw lots of CO2 that was bubbling up from the lake 4 months prior to the eruption. We saw the presence of deep seismicity, and we also find in the petrology that there's hotter magmas. So this all points to this magma being recharged by a deep magma recharge. What we find before the 2014 eruption, the explosive eruption, is that, and this is a satellite image showing the limited deformation of the volcano before the eruption. And actually, we only found about 2 or 3 weeks of intense seismicity before this eruption, of shallow seismicity. We didn't find much deformation either. So this points to this eruption being triggered internally, not from a magma input, but actually from the volatiles themselves cooling, differentiating, and becoming higher pressure, higher volatile overpressure. And this is kind of summarized in these 2 papers here, which you can read about more if you like. So this is very near the end of my talk now, and it's just really moving on to the future and potentially what we can do in terms of forecasting explosive eruptions at Kelut and other volcanoes. So how do we forecast volcanoes that are potentially triggered by these internal processes? So just simply the magma cooling down, generating more volatiles, generating more overpressure when the magma's not moving about like it might do in other volcanoes. One of the ideas is looking at gas. So commonly measured is sulfur dioxide. Sometimes we measure water and CO2. But halogens, so things like chlorine, fluorine, and bromine, might have more of an impact when the magma is not moving at depth. And that's because CO2 and SO2 are very much dependent on, or how they outgas from magma is very much dependent on their pressure, the pressure of which magma moves. So if the magma is moving from a deep to a shallow place, which it sometimes does, and a great example again is from Eruptive, which showed more CO2 to SO2 ratios before the explosive eruption in 2010. But sometimes the magma won't move at all, as we showed in this Kelut example. So in this instance, halogens might be a better idea. Some of the studies that I've been doing, I'm writing up currently, show that experiments show that this is controlled by the melt composition. So very much if the magma is cooling down is changing in its silica content, then it could have an effect on how the halogens then degas. So cooling differentiation, water saturation will affect the melt composition considerably and will make sure that the halogens and degas. So this could be an idea potentially for the future that might help us monitor these volcanoes. So for instance, if we cool magmas, they'll start to differentiate, increase in the silica content, and this will mean that they're more likely to outgas like fluorine. So we can compile data in a statistical model, and this is something I'm doing later, to understand how the degassing behavior will occur. And that's something I'm doing in the future. So anyway, just to summarize my talk, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm happy to answer some questions. So different mechanisms can lead to explosive and effusive behavior. As we saw, it's not a simple problem. It's connected to lots of different things. We can have transitions on different scales, and these can be driven by different feedback cycles, either open system or closed system. And these involve things like ascent rate and outgassing efficiency as the main factors, which I showed in that XY diagram. Explosive Plinian eruptions, I would say the least well understood. And I think we need to do more research into kind of these factors that control open or closed system degassing. So looking at how the magma is stored under the volcano, overpressure, how the volatiles behave, and outgas before. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer some questions. This is a picture from our time with ITB, collaborating with ITB in Krakatoa.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. Very nice presentation. We really enjoy your presentation about the volcano. Actually, we already have 4 questions. Maybe we will start with 2 questions first. So you can see in the question and answer. The first question is from Pak Seftiawan Rizal from University of Brawijaya. The question is, do you have thought about Sinabung volcano in North Sumatra? Because since 16th century, it's never been recorded as an active volcano, but start from 2010 until today, it always erupts.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's some colleagues looking at this and think it's relating to Toba, that it might be connected to the Toba magma input. So it could be maybe a shift from magma that's coming up, that used to come up from it to the Toba caldera, but now has been diverted towards Singabung. So perhaps since 2010, we're getting more magma input towards the north. I think it's the northwest. And it could be, and we see this with eruptions such as Sufra Hills in Montserrat, that we can have long-lived dome eruptions which have explosive eruptions, and they can last for decades. And they can last for decades, erupt a lot of magma, like Singabung's been doing since 2010, and then they can stop again for a number of years or even hundreds of years. So it's kind of confusing that they have these kind of that episodicity, but it might be related to that magma input. Potentially, it's changed from Toba to Singabung.
Yeah, just we are worried because Toba and Sinabung something like a very, very close friend. Yeah, you are thinking about the possibility or about the next eruption from Sinabung volcano. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And then the second question from my student from Agata University. This is Chananda. There are 2 questions. The first question is, are the initial volatile concentration, sulfur, fluor, chlor, CO2, H2O, and the gassing trend in deeper magma reservoir affecting the eruption style of low viscosity magma to be more explosive or less explosive? And then how about the partial pressure of those volatiles above and crystallinity equilibrium in the shallow water conduit?
Yeah, yeah. So it's a good question, and it's kind of complicated, and I don't think we are at the stage of properly understanding that yet. Initial volatile concentrations, such as fluorine, chlorine, carbon dioxide, water, although they do have an effect, the absolute amount is not correlated with explosivity. So if the more water, more CO2 that you have, the more explosive it will be. So that's what we do know. Some of the research I'm looking into and others, perhaps there is a sweet spot of water contents, CO2 contents, that is somewhere in the middle that makes it more likely to be explosive. But that's a really interesting question that we're trying to understand at the moment. Yeah, that's what I have to say about that, I guess.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And then he found the product are coming from the interaction from more than one melt, which is observed as banded pumice with distinct character between it band, including microlite abundance and bubble occurrence. Thus, the commingled occurrence is controlled by the rate of ascent, which trigger the explosive eruption, or maybe other other controls.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I've in looking at the 2014 eruption products, I've found the same things that you see in of pumice as well. And yeah, we should have a discussion about this, Yananda, and as well, because we might be looking at very similar things. So I think it comes from the same melt, even though one is very dark and one is very light. Actually, we think that color, I mean, so the composition is exactly the same, which is really interesting. So it's not more than one melt, but it's actually just one melt. But you're right in the second half of your question there, is that it's probably due to the rate at which that same magma traveled or differed rather. So the microlite abundance, as you say, I think, and the viscosity as well as other things, has the biggest control on that color. So yeah, I'm happy to talk an email with you more, Yananda, and talk about that more. That could be really interesting.
Okay, that's good. Thank you, Mike. Yeah, very interesting. So you said actually they are coming from one melt, eh? Only different color.
Yeah, I think so. They're coming from one melt, but they're probably ascending differently.
Okay.
Because they ascend differently, and that one produces more crystals, and the one that produces more these tiny microlite crystals makes it darker in appearance.
I see. Okay, thank you. And then the third question from my colleague from ITB, Ibu Nini, can you explain more detail about the role of water, in particular meteoric water, during magma ascending to the formation of bubble? Magma bubble or degassing, something like that.
Right, yes. Yeah, so meteoric water, so water that's come from, say, a lake or from the surface. I think that can have, it can produce initially more explosive eruptions. Again, it depends on the ratio between how much water there is to magma. So again, there's a sweet spot. If you have too much water, such as underneath the ocean, then actually that can lessen the explosivity of the eruption. But if you have water and magma at shallow level, then when magma comes into contact with that water, it can form these kind of shock. It can form it into glass very, very quickly. It can cool it very quickly and fragment the magma into lots of different ash particles. and form explosive eruptions. So certainly with Krakatoa, after the flank collapse, we saw lots of free magma eruptions, but that was also because there was much more magma coming up at a faster rate. So it was both more explosive because more magma at a faster rate was coming up, and it was being more fragmented into lots of tiny ash particles because it had interacted with water. But I would say that's the water was a secondary effect in that instance, so it's less important than the magma ascent rate.
Okay, so it means that the interaction condition between magma and water is very critical. Right?
Yeah, it is critical, but it's very much still controlled by the magma ascent rate. So if it's coming up faster, then a good example is Kelut again, really. So in 2007, the volcano, the magma erupted into a lake. As the dome grew, the lake was still there, and eventually it evaporated. But because it wasn't interacting at a fast rate with the water, then it didn't have an explosive effect. So, but then again, in 1919 and 1960, when the eruptions of Kelut occurred into the lake, the water was going, and 1990 isn't a good example, the magma came up much faster into the lake. And because it came up much faster, then it had a more explosive effect with the water.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And then we still have another 20 minutes. The next question from my student, Noradona, from master student in geothermal engineering. The question is, how the temperature affects the resistance to flow or viscosity in relation to the effusive and explosive volcanism?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting theme as well. And I think when the temperature changes at depth within the magma reservoir, even by 100 degrees, then that can affect the viscosity quite a bit. And so the same has been seen, the Kelut example that I showed, where the magma coming into the system before the 2007 effusive eruption seemed to heat the magma up. And when you heat the magma up, like when you heat up honey or any of these instances, the viscosity becomes lower and it enables more gases to be released. So I think it can have a big role to play as well. Fundamentally, it could affect whether you start the magma as an open system degassing. So if you heat the magma so much, the viscosity drops and the volatiles can be lost. And then if the volatiles are lost, then that might affect the magma ascent rate. It could be slower because there's less buoyancy in the magma. So it can affect it in these lots of incremental ways. It can start off a feedback mechanism.
Okay. Thank you, Mike.
And there's just to add to that, there's other examples from Quizapu in Chile, a volcano that look at that, and also a recent Nature Geoscience paper from Italy, Etna actually, which showed some of the temperature effect in the eruptive style as well.
Okay, thank you. And then the fifth question from Bintang Noratama from University of Pajajaran, also from Bandung. Is there any correlation between volcanoes and their location regarding the explosion? For example, in the subduction system, we have transect volcanic chain and then back-axis volcanic chain. It depends on the location or not?
Yeah, there is a pattern, and that pattern is very much defined by the magma's ability to become more silicic. So because subduction zone volcanoes, well, we know that as I said in the start, the talk, that explosive eruptions are more likely to come from silicic magma reservoirs. And we know that in subduction zone settings that silica magma is more common. So because of that, subduction zone volcanoes are generally thought to be more explosive. But as well as hotspots, we see in Tenerife lots of explosive eruptions in its history. And that's because it generates these kind of more evolved magmas as well. Another thing to say, and mid-ocean ridges, stuff like that, they're underneath the water a lot of the time. Sometimes, for instance, in Iceland, which is a mid-ocean ridge and a hotspot, you can form these explosive eruptions. So generally, there's this kind of rule that subduction zone volcanoes have more explosive eruptions, but it's not always the case, as we find in Iceland and things like that. And I guess the other reason why they're more explosive is because there's more magma, there's more gases being, stuff like water, CO2, halogens, they're being dragged into subduction zones and they're coming off into the volcanoes as well. So those can make these magmas more richer and volatiles as well.
Yeah, okay, Mike, thank you very much. Is there any question from the attendee or participant, maybe? Idam or Mas Ferry, Mas Idam, do you have any question?
Mas Mirjam, for me, okay?
Yeah, yeah, okay. Good,
Thank you
Yeah,
very much. Very interesting, Mike, your presentation.
Thanks, Idam.
My question about the, actually, I'm not really understand about the decompression. Yeah, you said that the difference between the explosive and explosive is because of the magma ascent and also the decompression. And I'm still not, I'm still cannot get imaging about in the conduit, how the magma, is it in the magma, is it the magma ascent is one pattern or different pattern? And then also, what's the meaning of the decompression itself? Is it one in the single decompression or multi-decompression?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so generally with effusive eruptions, you have slower decompression, and I guess that what that means is that you have the magma. If you see a magma, maybe it's at one depth, say 3 kilometers depth, and then it's the rate at which that magma sees a loss of pressure. So that the amount that the magma can lose its pressure, and that's often coupled with how fast it moves up to the surface. So it's kind of like with another good analogy is a Coke bottle, with you opening the cap very slowly and maybe incrementally, and then you might find that if you do it, that would be imitating a multi-step decompression rate. So you open the Coke bottle a little bit, and there might be a little bit of pressure lost, and you open it a little bit more, little bit of pressure lost, and overall the decompression rate is slow, but it's often defined in the more effusive eruptions by this multi-step decompression, where it kind of moves up a bit, it stalls, moves up a little bit as well. But I think there could be slow, continuous decompression could lead to effusive eruptions as well. But I think that's the definite need for more research in that area.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Adam.
Okay, yeah, okay. Thank you, Mike. The last, this is not question. Actually, this is the request from the all audience. Is it possible for the audience to get the presentation materials?
Yeah, sure. So I've sent that to you, Mirzam. So feel free to share that.
Okay, yeah. Okay, you can hear from Dr. Mike Cassidy that you can get the presentation material. Maybe I will put all the material in our website so you can download directly. Okay, once again, thank you very much for your very nice talk for today. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm
sorry I couldn't be in Bandung this time. I was in Bandung maybe last August. And sorry I couldn't be there this time, but it's nice to chat to you all. And so I think it's really important to to all the future volcanologists there, hopefully after Indonesian's dangerous volcanoes.
Yeah, actually, this time you come to Bandung only virtually. So next year, hopefully, you can visit.
We'll see how. Yeah, hopefully, we'll see what happens.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have finished the guest lecture of the day. We have learned a lot today regarding explosive or effusive, investigating the factors controlling volcanic explosivity. What we have learned today will be useful for us in the future. Before we close this session, would you please to turn on the camera, especially for the panelists? We would like to have photo session together. Pak Irwan is still here. There is no Pak Irwan. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Pak Ferry, thank you very much for your coming, Pak Ferry.
Oh, I can't hear you. I think you're on mute.
Still mute, Pak Ferry.
So I'm sorry, I just finished for last year undergraduate defense, so I just can join right now. Nice to meet you, Cassidy.
Nice to meet you, very.
Okay. Once again, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Ferry.
Thank you very much.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let me to inform you that next month we will have another interesting guest lecture from my college, still from UK, from British Geological Survey, and also from University of Birmingham. Please check the date through official Instagram of our faculty. And then once again, thank you, Dr. Michael Cassidy. Thank you, Pak Idam. Thank you, Pak Ferry. Thank you, my colleague and all the audience. Thank you, everyone. See you next month. Stay healthy and have a good day.
Thank you. Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam. Great.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Yeah.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Yeah, see you there.
See you.
Bye.
Baik, Pak Ida sama Pak Ferry, semoga ini Mbak Hana ya, terima kasih atas supportnya. Nanti kita insya Allah 2 minggu lagi bertemu pada pembicara berikutnya. Sudah ada itu dari British Geological Survey dan juga dari University of Birmingham. Ya, mudah-mudahan kita bisa laksanakan sesuai waktu. Apa yang kita laksanakan hari ini bisa bermanfaat, khususnya buat mahasiswa kita yang mengikuti dan juga semua yang hadir pada pertemuan sore ini. Sekali lagi terima kasih Pak Idam, Pak Ferry, juga Pak Hana, Pak Dekan sebenarnya sudah keluar, juga para audiens ya. Sehat selalu, sampai ketemu lagi bulan depan di acara yang sama, kuliah tamu yang diprakarsai oleh Teknik Geologi ITB, Fakultas Ilmu dan Teknologi Kebumian. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih Pak Mizam.
Terima kasih Pak Mizam.
Baik, kita ini ya, nanti mungkin harus diakhiri sama ini ya. Baik, saya leave ya. Pak Ida, Pak Ferry, semuanya.
Oke, sama-sama.
Baik, sama-sama,
ya,
Mas.
Assalamualaikum.
Ya. Assalamualaikum. Mari Mas Ferry juga duluan. Ya.
Ya, enggak. Mas Ida, makasih.